Om Shri Ganeshaya Namaha. Respected colleagues, friends, Sanskrit scholars, scientists, researchers, students, friends, my respectful pranam to all of you. I come before you not as an authority on the Mahabharata, but as a physician, neurologist, and neuroscientist, and above all, as a student who has found himself returning again and again to the Mahabharata with increasing curiosity. Most of my professional life has been devoted to neuroscience. A scientific paper begins with a question, progresses through hypothesis, ethics approval, data collection, analysis writing, peer review, revision, and often years of work before publication. And this experience has taught me profound respect for careful observation, because observation is the beginning of every scientific discovery. And when I began reading the Mahabharata seriously about 2 years ago, I repeatedly stopped, not because of miracles, but because of the astonishing depth of human observation. This immense work of approximately 100,000 verses weaves together the philosophy, ethics, politics, family life, education, grief, wisdom, memory, emotion, duty, leadership, conflict, and identity into a coherent whole. As a neurologist, I found this extraordinary. Rather than asking whether the Mahabharata already contained modern neuroscience, I began asking a different question. Can the Mahabharata help us ask better scientific questions about the human mind? About the human mind. When I read the Mahabharata today, I see one of humanity's greatest studies of human behavior. The greatest study of human behavior. Arjuna raises questions about stress. Krishna, Bhagavan Krishna, about cognition and meaning, and Bhishma about aging and wisdom, Vidura about judgment, Duryodhan about envy, Karna about identity, Eklavya about learning, Drona about expertise, Shakuntala about memory, Nala about resilience, and Yaksha about wisdom. The Mahabharata does not replace neuroscience, nor does neuroscience prove Mahabharata. Rather, the epic preserves remarkably rich observations about human experience that deserve careful scientific investigation. Observation precedes explanation, just as physicians first observe patients before diagnosing disease. Vyasa Rishi often presents the lived experience of grief, fear, conflict, and moral struggle before offering philosophical interpretation. This literary method itself deserves admiration. And therefore, I propose a simple framework. Read the original Sanskrit carefully. The original Sanskrit, because there are meanings within meanings in the language, which no translation can really do a good service. So read the original Sanskrit carefully. Study the traditional commentaries. Identify the psychological construct being described. Compare it with current scientific knowledge. Formulate testable hypotheses. Compare it with current scientific knowledge and investigate them with rigorous methods. Over the last several years, one conviction has gradually become stronger within me. One conviction has gradually become stronger within me. महाभारत को सम्मान देने का सर्वोत्तम मार्ग केवल उसका पाठ करना नहीं है, उसका गंभीर अध्ययन करना, उसके प्रश्नों को समझना, उन्हें मानवता के कल्याण के लिए नए वैज्ञानिक अनुसंधानों में रूपांतरित करना भी है. उसमें रूपांतरित करना भी है. If a text has inspired humanity for millennia, perhaps it still has the capacity to inspire new discoveries. उसके प्रश्नों को समझना और उन्हें मानवता के कल्याण के लिए नए वैज्ञानिक अनुसंधानों में रूपांतरित करना आवश्यक है. महाभारत को सम्मान देने का सर्वोत्तम मार्ग केवल उसका पाठ करना ही नहीं, उसका गंभीर अध्ययन करना, उसके प्रश्नों को समझना और उन्हें मानवता के कल्याण के लिए नए वैज्ञानिक अनुसंधानों में रूपांतरित करना है. यह बात मैं बार बार कह रहा हूं. And then I say that if a text has inspired humanity for millennia, perhaps it still has the capacity to inspire new discoveries. I'm repeating this, emphasizing on it. Not because Mahabharata, it replaces science, but because it continues to illuminate the questions that science should ask. I hope that one day Sanskrit universities will not only preserve our intellectual heritage, but also become places where new knowledge is created through collaboration among Sanskrit scholars, neurologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, engineers, educators, and public health researchers. In the remainder of this talk, we shall explore how individual episodes of Mahabharata, Arjun, Bhishma, Eklavya, Karna, Vidur, Shakuntala, Nala, the Yaksha, Prashna, and others can inspire rigorous questions in neuroscience, psychology, medicine, education, and human flourishing. So first, we should neither be blind in accepting, nor should we should be humble, and we should neither just blindly reject the knowledge. I come across people who connect Mahabharata with religion without having ever read a single chapter from this great text. When I started reading the book, I realized the observation of the writer. So much traditional knowledge that exists in Mahabharata today is all that is very relevant, not only from neurology standpoint, from social psychology, from humanities standpoint, from war management standpoint. So, as I said earlier, the vision with which I'm thinking about pursuing Mahabharata studies is essentially to bring the Sanskrit scholars and scientists into dialogue, preserve the tradition while generating new knowledge, and build interdisciplinary collaborations. Let's honor the Mahabharata through deep study, transform observations into rigorous research, and let ancient wisdom inspire the future discovery. That should be our goal. The Mahabharata as a laboratory of the human mind. Why did Vyasa describe this? As I continued reading the Mahabharata, I noticed that whenever an important emotional event occurred, Vyasa rarely described only the external event. Instead, he described what happened inside the individual: perception, emotion, memory, reasoning, conflict, motivation, self-control, wisdom, regret, hope, fear, and resilience. This immediately attracted my attention as a neurologist because modern neuroscience asks precisely these questions. Mahabharata is not merely about war, its central subject is human mind. Throughout the epic, we repeatedly encounter enduring questions. Why do intelligent people make poor decisions? It's very relevant today. Many intelligent people, or so-called intelligent people, are making several poor decisions which are adversely affecting the world and our lives. Why does knowledge sometimes fail to guide behavior? So having knowledge, the book knowledge, doesn't really guide the behavior. Why does attachment cloud judgment? Attachment clouds judgment. Why does that happen? Why does envy persist despite repeated failure? How is wisdom acquired? Why does suffering strengthen one person while overwhelming another? How does disciplined practice create extraordinary expertise? Why does that happen? How does that happen? Why does that happen? One remarkable literary feature is that the Mahabharata often observes before it explains. Arjuna's crisis is first described through bodily and psychological symptoms before Krishna offers philosophical guidance. In medicine, we begin with observation before diagnosis. This parallel is striking. Every scientific discipline begins with observation. Astronomy observed the heavens, biology observed living organisms, and neurology begins by observing patients. The Mahabharata repeatedly demonstrates careful observation of human behavior. Whether or not we call this science, the quality of observation deserves attention. It deserves attention. A narrative may also be viewed as a rich collection of observations. Every observation can generate hypotheses, and every hypothesis may eventually become an experiment. The Mahabharata is therefore not a database of conclusions, but a treasury of questions. Shakuntala invites reflection on memory, recognition, and contextual retrieval. King Dushyant's failure to recognize her raises questions about how memories are retrieved, how emotion influences recollection, and how contextual cues shape recognition. Modern cognitive neuroscience studies precisely these phenomena. Bhishma inspires questions about healthy aging and cognitive reserve. His body is failing, yet judgment, memory, and teaching remains extraordinary. Modern neuroscience suggests that lifelong intellectual engagement, multilingualism, education, and social participation may contribute to cognitive resilience. May contribute to cognitive resilience. Whether lifelong Sanskrit scholarship contributes similarly remains an open and testable question, though there are papers about Sanskrit effect. There's a paper about Sanskrit effect. Eklavya naturally leads us to neuroplasticity. Eklavya, his example, leads us to neuroplasticity thought. Through disciplined, motivated, self-directed practice, he develops exceptional expertise. And we, the neuroscientists, have demonstrated that practice reshapes the nervous system. The question is not whether the Mahabharata anticipated neuroplasticity, but how stories such as Eklavya's inspired new investigation into learning and expertise. How did he learn to become an expert in what he learned? Drona illustrates deliberate practice. Excellence requires structured instruction, feedback, correction, and progressive refinement. Educational neuroscience increasingly studies why certain forms of instruction produce durable learning. Traditional Gurukul pedagogy may offer valuable insights deserving rigorous investigation. Karna's life. Karna's life. It is one of the world's great studies of identity, belonging, exclusion, loyalty, and resilience. Modern psychology recognizes that social exclusion affects emotional well-being, motivation, stress physiology, and decision-making. Karna's story raises profound questions about identity, formation, and resilience. Duryodhana illustrates the gap between knowing and doing. Persistent envy, social comparison, and failure to modify behavior despite repeated consequences resemble questions now investigated through the neuroscience of reward, executive control, motivation, and habit formation. Nala's story. Nala's story explores gambling, impulsivity, adversity, and recovery. Today, psychiatry studies gambling disorder, addiction, and resilience. The literary narrative offers a powerful human context for these scientific questions. Vidura. Vidura repeatedly demonstrates calm judgment under pressure. Vidura demonstrates calm judgment under pressure. Modern neuropsychology studies executive function, wisdom, and moral reasoning. Can wisdom itself be measured or cultivated? The Mahabharata invites that inquiry. The Yaksha Prashna tests discernment. Yaksha Prashna tests the discernment rather than the factual recall. It challenges reflection, integration, and metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking. These remain active area of cognitive science. What impressed me most is that all these stories revolve around attention, learning, memory, emotion, identity, decision-making, wisdom, and resilience. These are among the central themes of the contemporary neuroscience. Rather than asking whether the Mahabharata contains neuroscience, I now ask, which observations within Mahabharata deserve scientific investigation? That single change in the way we ask questions, that single change transforms the conversation from defending the past to creating the new knowledge. And traditionally, we are the ones who have gone on and on and on in the search of Satya, the knowledge, the truth. And that should be our approach. If these narratives contain observations worthy of investigation, then the next question becomes, how do we transform an observation from the Mahabharata into rigorous scientific hypothesis? And we are talking about Mahabharata today, but I intend to mean that how do we transform the observation from the Sanskrit literature, like Mahabharata and many others, Vedanta, for instance, into a rigorous scientific hypothesis. So we'll move on to doing that methodological journey in the next slides. So a new way of asking questions. Let's talk about this. From shloka to science. Scientific progress begins not with sophisticated instruments. It's not about the instruments, the tools that we use. That's not important. That is important, but the scientific progress begins not with sophisticated instruments, but with a good question. MRI scanners, EEG machines, and artificial intelligence help answer questions, but curiosity discovers them. As I read the Mahabharata, I repeatedly encountered observations that naturally generated scientific questions. Naturally generated scientific questions. Science begins with observation. Someone notices a phenomena, proposes a hypothesis, tests it, and invites independent replication. The Mahabharata contributes most strongly to the first step, careful observation of human behavior. Inspiration is not evidence. Inspiration is not evidence. A Sanskrit verse may inspire an experiment, but it does not prove the result of that experiment. Preserving this distinction protects both science and the integrity of the traditional past. That's very important. That's very important. Inspiration is not evidence. A Sanskrit verse may inspire an experiment. It may be inspirational, but it does not prove the result of that experiment. Preserving this distinction protects both science and the integrity of the traditional text. So the first step is read the original Sanskrit carefully. Read the original text carefully. Begin with the text itself rather than translations or isolated quotations. Identify precisely what is described and what is not described. Then the next step, step 2. Study the traditional commentaries before proposing scientific interpretations. Understand how classical commentators interpret concepts such as buddhi, smruti, dhruti, manas, prajna, avadhana, and samatva. Modern science should begin after learning from the traditional scholarship. Then the next step, define the construct. Ask what modern psychological construct most closely resembles the Sanskrit concept under discussion. Avoid premature one-to-one translations. Sometimes there will be close correspondence, sometimes there will not. Review the scientific literature. That's the next step. Review it. Search contemporary neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry, neuropsychology, and cognitive science to determine what is already known and where genuine gaps remain. Then the next step, formulate a testable hypothesis. Formulate a testable hypothesis. Replace broad claims with specific falsifiable statements. For example, instead of claiming that Sanskrit improves memory, propose that structured Sanskrit recitation over several years may improve validated measures of sustained attention compared with appropriate control groups. Let me repeat this example. Instead of claiming that Sanskrit improves memory, propose that structured Sanskrit recitation over several years may improve validated measures of sustained attention compared with appropriate control groups. Then the next step, design the study. Select methods appropriate to the question. Neuropsychological assessment, for example, behavioral testing, electroencephalogram, MRI, eye tracking, physiological measures, clinical evaluation, longitudinal follow-up. The methodology should follow the question, not the reverse. The methodology should follow the research question. It should not be the other way around. And then replicate. No single study is definitive. Replication across institutions and population is essential before drawing strong conclusions. That's the scientific methodology. That's the scientific methodology. Let's go back to the example of Eklavya. Observation. Extraordinary expertise develops through disciplined practice. Okay. Modern constructs include neuroplasticity, motivation, motor learning, and skill acquisition. So a future study could compare expert Sanskrit reciters, musicians, chess players, athletes, and match controls using attention testing, MRI, EEG, and longitudinal assessment. Next example, Bhishma. Next example is Bhishma Pitamaha, as we call him. What's the observation? Exceptional wisdom and cognition in advanced age, despite physical suffering. Modern concepts include cognitive reserve, successful aging, and lifelong learning. Longitudinal studies of traditional scholars could investigate cognitive trajectories while accounting for education, health, multilingualism, and lifestyle. Meditation and mental imagery. That deserves discussion. That deserves the discussion. The Mahabharata repeatedly refers to sustained attention, contemplation, visualization, and mental discipline. Modern neuroscience, these days, suggests that different forms of meditation influence attention, emotional regulation, and large-scale brain networks, although effects vary by practice and methodology. The effect varies by the practice and the methodology. Avadhan. It represents another extraordinary opportunity. Rather than asking whether it is miraculous, we should ask which cognitive processes support such performance. Working memory, divided attention, cognitive flexibility, and error monitoring are all plausible areas of investigation. The traditional practice of identifying the Rishi, Chandas, Devtas, and Vinyog before mantra recitation has profound ritual significance. In fact, it is said that no mantra should be read or chanted without doing the Vinyog. The Vinyog is must. From the perspective of intellectual history, the Vinyog, represents a sophisticated culture of preserving attribution and lineage. In the Vinyog, you take the name of the Rishi, Chand, Devata. Yes, the Rishi who saw the mantra. You have to, you take their names and then you do the mantra recitation. So from the perspective of intellectual history, it also reflects a sophisticated culture of preserving attribution and lineage, although not equivalent to modern academic citation. Both traditions emphasize careful acknowledgement of sources and continuity of knowledge. The future lies in dialogue. The future lies in dialogue. Imagine a Sanskrit scholar and a neuroscientist reading the same passage together. One asks what the verse means, the other asks how the underlying observation might be studied. Together, they generate questions that neither discipline could have produced alone. So let's talk about transition. Having established a methodology for moving from text to hypothesis, we now turn to the current state of neuroscience. What does modern neuroscience already know about stress, attention, memory, neuroplasticity, executive function, aging, wisdom, and emotional regulation that can illuminate these observations? that can illuminate these observations. Let me say something very clearly, that the Mahabharata does not teach neuroscience in the modern sense. It does not. Rather, it teaches us what to observe about human condition. That's what it teaches us. Modern neuroscience begins with neurons, synapses, brain networks, whereas the Mahabharata begins with lived human experience, grief, fear, courage, wisdom, identity, memory, and duty. Together, they offer complementary perspectives on the human mind. Before discussing specific brain systems, it is useful to remember that the brain evolved to help organisms survive and adapt. The brain developed to help us survive. Approximately 86 billion neurons communicate through trillions of synapses, produce thought, emotion, memory, language, movement, and social interaction. And these are precisely the experiences that dominate the Mahabharata. The brain functions as an interconnected network. The brain functions as interconnected network. Not as isolated regions acting independently. Attention, memory, language, emotion, and decision-making arise from the coordinated neural activity across distributed systems. This is conceptually similar to the way Mahabharata portrays human behavior as the product of many interacting influences rather than a single cause. Arjuna's crisis provides one of the most striking literary descriptions of acute stress. The Bhagavad Gita describes trembling, dry mouth, weakness, burning sensation, inability to continue, and confusion. Modern medicine recognizes these as measurable manifestations of the physiological stress response involving the autonomic activation, plus changes in attention, working memory, and decision making. Krishna's dialogue illustrates the power of changing interpretation without changing external reality. I call him the best neuropsychologist or the cognitive behavioral therapist that the mankind has ever had. Lord Krishna, Bhagavan Krishna. His dialogue illustrates the power of changing interpretation without changing external reality. Modern psychology refers to the important process known as cognitive reappraisal, in which individuals reinterpret difficult situations in ways that alter emotional responses. Although Krishna's teaching cannot be reduced to psychotherapy, even though I tend to call it, the parallel invites meaningful scientific reflection. Eklavya. He illustrates neuroplasticity. Through disciplined practice, modern neuroscience has shown that learning reshapes the nervous system throughout life. Every musician, athlete, surgeon, language learner, the Vedic reciters demonstrates neuroplasticity. The scientific question is not whether the Mahabharata anticipated the concept, but how different forms of long-term practice influence the brain. How they influence the brain. Drona. He exemplifies deliberate practice. Excellence depends not only upon repetition, but also upon feedback, error correction, progressive refinement, and motivation. Educational neuroscience increasingly studies why structured teaching produces durable expertise. Educational neuroscience increasingly studies why structured teaching produces durable expertise. Bhishma naturally raises questions regarding cognitive reserve and successful aging. Bhishma Pitama. Lifelong education, multilingualism, social engagement, and intellectually demanding activities appear to promote resilience against age-related cognitive decline. Whether lifelong Sanskrit scholarship contributes similarly remains an important research question. Karna. His life illustrates identity, belonging, exclusion, resilience, and social cognition. Modern neuroscience increasingly recognizes that social experiences profoundly influence emotional well-being, stress physiology, and behavior. His story encourages research into identity formation and resilience. Duryodhan, some call him Suyodhan. Some call him Suyodhan. Duryodhan. Duryodhan highlights the gap between knowing and doing. Reward processing, habit formation, executive control, and motivation all contribute to behavior. Modern neuroscience continues to investigate why insight alone is often insufficient for behavioral change. Vidur, he exemplifies executive function, thoughtful judgment, and moral reasoning. Modern neuropsychology studies planning, response inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and wisdom using behavioral assessment and neuroimaging. The Mahabharata reminds us that wisdom extends beyond intelligence alone. Beyond intelligence alone. Yaksha Prashna. So Yaksha story we all know. He asks some prashna, some questions, and that explores metacognition, the capacity to reflect upon one's own thinking rather than testing factual memory. The dialogue evaluates discernment, judgment, and perspective. Contemporary cognitive science increasingly recognizes metacognition as central to expert decision-making. The Mahabharata repeatedly refers to meditation, contemplation, mental discipline, and sustained attention. Sustained attention. Contemporary neuroscience suggests that attentional training may influence emotional regulation, stress responses, and cognitive performance, although effects vary across traditions and methodologies. Mental imagery is another recurring theme. Modern research demonstrates that visualization recruits many of the same neural systems involved in perception and action. Athletes, musicians, surgeons, and pilots routinely use structured mental rehearsal. Traditional contemplative practices invite comparable scientific questions. Taken together, Arjun, Krishna, Bhishma, Eklavya, Drona, Karna, Vidur, Duryodhan, the Yaksh, and the other figures illustrate enduring themes of attention, of learning, of motivation. Identity, wisdom, resilience, and self-regulation. The Mahabharata preserves these observations with remarkable richness. The neuroscience provides methods for studying them rigorously. The neuroscience provides opportunity to study them rigorously. So having reviewed what modern neuroscience already knows, the next step is to ask how Sanskrit scholars, neuroscientists, physicians, psychologists, educators, and engineers can work together to transform these observations into collaborative research progress. There's a need for research program where these different group of experts work together to promote this science. So as these ideas have evolved, one question has repeatedly arisen, has come again and again. Where do we begin? The Mahabharata is vast and modern neuroscience is equally expansive. No single individual can master every aspect of both disciplines. Fortunately, scientific progress has always depended upon collaboration, and perhaps the future of Indian knowledge system will as well. Sanskrit scholars and neuroscientists often study the same human phenomena from different perspectives. They study the same phenomena, but from different perspectives. The Sanskrit scholar begins with the text, language, and commentarial tradition. The neuroscientist begins with observation, experiment, and measurement. These perspectives are complementary rather than competitive. Now, the Mahabharata itself provides an extraordinary research agenda. Mahabharata provides a vast scope to conduct research. For instance, the example of Arjun, who inspires question about stress, Bhishma about healthy aging. We have repeated this previously. Eklavya about learning, Karna about identity, Vidura about wisdom, Nala about addiction and recovery, Shakuntala about memory, and the Yaksha, Prashna about reflective thinking. The challenge is not finding research question, but choosing which to investigate first. So first thing is we really need to understand that there is a need for identifying the gap in knowledge. If there is a gap in knowledge, that's the question that you want to tackle. Or there is some knowledge, but it needs validation. Then you want to repeat the experiment in a different set of population. And then you want to understand exactly what aspect of memory or attention or what kind of task the person was performing that you want to specifically investigate. Then you want to test which comparator group you are comparing your population with, the analytical methodology. So there are various aspects that need to be considered when you're designing a clinical study of this nature. So modern science contributes rigorous methodology, careful measurement, experimental design, statistical analysis, replication, and critical evaluation. These methods allow us to distinguish between intriguing ideas and reliable evidence while preserving respect for both science and traditional scholarship. And these are some of the things that those with scientific tendencies on both sides, the clinical side and Sanskrit side, and whoever else is interested, they need to learn, understand, get training in. And it's particularly more important in our landscape in India, where oftentimes the research methodology is not the primary goal of education, which is unfortunate. And I may be wrong about it, but this is the common observation that I have noted. Learning the methodology is critical. It's critical. So imagine a Sanskrit professor and a neurologist reading the same passage together. The professor explains the language, context, and the traditional interpretation. The neurologist asks how the underlying observations might be investigated using neuropsychology, neuroimaging, physiology, how the longitudinal research would be designed and conducted. Together, they generate better questions than either discipline could produce independently. And that's where the importance of collaboration lies. So we need to learn the team effort. We need to do team science. We need to do collaborative research. And we need to work together, talk, attend each other's meeting, learn each other's science. Perhaps the most exciting possibility lies with students. And that's where I'm going to go. The younger generation is the future. The students, they can be trained in something that many senior people would not, because they would not necessarily, they have reached a status in the career that they may not be so much interested in 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 and then a lot of new technologies that are emerging, AI for instance, that's readily available for learning by younger generation who are pretty adapted learning the technology. So without undermining the importance, the senior people provide the wisdom, experience, and the younger generation can learn these new technologies and really help mobilize the science. The students of the future, therefore, are the key in my mind, but that doesn't, I don't intend to undermine the importance of senior people who come with the wisdom, and that wisdom is also important. Actually, that's more important. That wisdom is more important. But let's talk about the students. Imagine a student who studies Panini and Vyasa in the morning, cognitive psychology and neuroscience in the afternoon, statistics and scientific writing in the evening, and later participates in EEG, MRI, and behavioral research. Our Sanskrit student. Such scholars will not abandon Sanskrit. They will broaden its dialogue in modern science because they will have this knowledge and tool, plus the energy to move the field forward, to advance the science. Universities throughout India possess complementary strengths. Sanskrit universities preserve language, philology, and the centuries of intellectual tradition. Centuries of intellectual tradition. Medical institutions contribute clinical expertise, neuropsychology, neurology, psychiatry, imaging, research infrastructure. The engineering institutes contribute artificial intelligence, signal processing, computational linguistics, and data science. Together, they can investigate questions that none could answer alone, and that's why the partnership is important. That's why the partnership is important. One can imagine collaborations between institutions sitting next door to each other, Sampurnanand Vishwavidyalaya and the Department of Neurology in Banaras Hindu Vishwavidyalaya. Traditional scholars could define concepts such as smriti, buddhi, dhruti, avadhana, and prajna with philological precision, while clinicians and neuroscientists develop rigorous methods to investigate corresponding cognitive constructs. Similar collaborations could involve AIMS, IIT Mandi, which has a very strong Indian knowledge system research program, NIMHANS, and the international neuroscience centers. The work is not limited to neuroscience. The work is not limited to neuroscience. The Mahabharata naturally invites collaboration across psychiatry, psychology, education, public health, linguistics, artificial intelligence, anthropology, philosophy, religious studies, and cognitive science. The human mind does not belong to a single discipline, and neither does the Mahabharata. Public health represents another exciting frontier. The Mahabharata repeatedly discusses family life, caregiving, bereavement, leadership, social cohesion, resilience, education, and healthy aging. These are determinants of health as much as philosophical themes. Future interdisciplinary research may reveal how some traditional practices influence well-being, social connectedness, or mental health, while carefully distinguishing established evidence from hypotheses. Scientific humility remains essential. It remains essential. Scientific humility remains essential. Some hypotheses inspired by Mahabharata will be supported by evidence while others will not. Negative results are not failures. This must be understood. Negative results in research are not failures. They refine our understanding and strengthen scientific integrity. The Mahabharata itself repeatedly teaches humility, and the science asks us the same of us. It asks us the same of us. Ultimately, success would not mean proving the every verse anticipated modern neuroscience. Success would mean seeing Sanskrit scholars and neuroscientists publishing together, mentoring students together, establishing interdisciplinary training programs, conducting longitudinal studies, and generating new knowledge that begins there together and benefits the humanity. My own journey has convinced me that these disciplines enrich one another. Every time I return to Mahabharata, and for that matter, other scriptures like Vedanta, Gita, Upanishads, the Puranas, I discover another scientific question. Every time I return to neuroscience, I appreciate the Mahabharata more deeply. The dialogue between them has transformed the way I think as both physician and student. I therefore conclude this section not with instructions, but with invitation. Let us continue reading the Mahabharata with intellectual curiosity and scientific humility. Let us ask questions together, design careful studies together, publish together, mentor students together, and build collaborations that honor both rigorous scholarship and rigorous science. If collaboration is the path forward, then the next question naturally follows. What specific research programs could emerge from Mahabharata? So next, I'm going to talk about the practical research roadmap organized around themes, hypotheses, study design, and opportunities for interdisciplinary investigation. Throughout this lecture, I have suggested that Mahabharata is not merely a literary masterpiece or a philosophical text, but also an extraordinary record of observations about the human mind. And the next step is to ask how these observations may inspire rigorous scientific discovery. The purpose of interdisciplinary research is not to demonstrate that the Mahabharata secretly anticipated more modern neuroscience. No, that's not the goal. That's not the goal. The purpose of interdisciplinary research is not to demonstrate that Mahabharata secretly anticipated modern neuroscience. That's not possible, let's be honest. Rather, it is to identify observations that continue to generate meaningful, testable questions for medicine, neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry, education, and public health. When I read the Mahabharata today, I keep a notebook nearby. Every few pages, another research questions appear. Some concern stress, other memory, expertise, compassion, healthy aging, identity, leadership, or resilience. Few works continue generating new hypotheses thousands of years after their composition. So Mahabharata is terrific about that. Terrific. One useful way to organize this work is through thematic research programs rather than isolated projects. For example, a program on attention and avadhana could investigate sustained attention, divided attention, working memory, eye movements, EEG, and longitudinal cognitive outcomes among expert practitioners. A second research theme concerns memory. Second theme is about memory. How do expert reciters organize information? What retrieval strategies do they employ? Does prolonged oral learning influence memory networks, multilingual processing, or cognitive reserve? Such questions invite collaboration among Sanskrit scholars, neuropsychologists, and cognitive neuroscientists. A third theme concerns neuroplasticity. Inspired by Eklavya and Drona, future studies could investigate deliberate practice, motivation, and expertise and skill acquisition through longitudinal behavioral testing, MRI, EEG, and educational neuroscience. Another major theme is emotional regulation. Krishna's dialogue, Gita. Krishna's dialogue with Arjuna naturally raises questions about cognitive reappraisal, resilience, meaning-making, and stress reduction. Future studies may combine psychometric assessment with physiological measures such as heart rate variability, neuroimaging, and longitudinal follow-up. Bhishma, he inspires questions regarding healthy aging and cognitive reserve, lifelong scholarship, multilingualism, Continuous teaching and intellectual engagement may represent valuable models for investigating successful cognitive aging in later life. Kern, it invites research into identity, belonging, social exclusion, resilience, and mental health. Modern social neuroscience increasingly recognizes that these experiences shape cognition, emotion, and long-term well-being. Vidur and Yaksha Prashna inspire research into wisdom, executive function, moral reasoning, metacognition, and reflective decision-making. These remain active areas of psychology and cognitive science. Cognitive science. Talked about all this. So the Mahabharata also suggests opportunities extending beyond neuroscience, education, linguistics, artificial intelligence, public health, behavioral economics, philosophy, anthropology, and leadership studies all find rich material within its narratives. Traditional Sanskrit education itself deserves careful scientific study. Memorization, recitation, grammar, debate, contemplation, and lifelong scholarship may each provide unique opportunities for understanding, learning, expertise, and cognitive resilience. Cognitive resilience. Artificial intelligence offers additional opportunities. Digital Sanskrit corpora, semantic analysis, manuscript comparison, speech recognition, knowledge graphs, and computational linguistics may help scholars discover patterns across Mahabharata and related texts that were previously difficult to identify. Future progress will require interdisciplinary networks rather than isolated investigators. Sanskrit universities, medical colleges, engineering institutes, psychology departments, and public health schools each contribute distinct expertise. Together, they can address questions that none could answer independently. Perhaps the greatest beneficiaries of such collaborations will be the students, the future. The students, they will benefit probably the most, which is what I want as well. Imagine doctoral trainees equally comfortable reading Sanskrit manuscripts, interpreting traditional commentaries, designing neuropsychological experiments, analyzing EEG recordings, applying statistics, and publishing internationally, and competing with the world, and raising the reputation of the universities, making the universities once again the center of learning of international stature, where people from around the world will start coming back. People like me would not have to leave my country to go elsewhere and earn education. Every new scientific field begins modestly with one conversation, one collaboration, one pilot study, one student, and one carefully framed question. There is every reason to believe that interdisciplinary Mahabharata research can develop in the same way. I therefore invite Sanskrit scholars and scientists alike to continue this dialogue. Read the Mahabharata with curiosity, read neuroscience with humility, and allow both traditions to enrich one another. The greatest contribution of the Mahabharata to the future may not be the answer it contains, but the questions it continues to inspire. And that should be the goal. So, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, scholars, may I propose a Mahabharata research atlas. I think that will be something cool to have because it's a huge volume, 6-volume Gita press publication. So much knowledge there. So may I suggest to build a research atlas. So a practical research atlas. So rather than claiming that the epic anticipated modern neuroscience, which would be completely false, the neuroscience didn't exist in those days as we think of it in the contemporary times, but it identifies episodes that inspire scientifically testable questions. So each theme can be presented as a bridge between traditional scholarship and modern investigation. Each entry can follow a common framework like Mahabharata observation, traditional interpretation, related modern scientific concepts, current evidence, research gaps, possible study designs, potential collaborators, and possible societal impact of that. That's something that can be done. That's something that can be done. For instance, Arjuna's crisis. So stress physiology, autonomic response, executive function, moral conflict, and then study longitudinal stress resilience and value-based decision-making. And similar things, similar exercise can be done for Eklavya, Bhishma, Shakuntala, Karna, Vidur, Yaksha, Prashna, Nala, Draupadi, Krishna, Drona. One can tag attention, emotional regulation, self-control, and neuroplasticity when dealing with meditation and design longitudinal contemplative studies. Or do something similar kind of investigation for mental imagery, or test them in the educational rehabilitation applications. Avadhana, Sanskrit learning, bilingualism. It can be investigated in childhood longitudinal cohorts or even adult cohorts. Testing for cognitive reserve, executive function, and can include variables from neuropsychological testing for comparison between the active Sanskrit group versus non-Sanskrit group. All these are possible. An interdisciplinary network may unite Sanskrit scholars, and therefore it should be considered. It can unite the Sanskrit scholars with neurologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, linguists, engineers, AI researchers, educators. And I think the organization like Indian Knowledge System can play an important role here, bringing together the colleagues, the experts from around the world who may be interested in sharing their expertise and building this research atlas, deciding common data elements, guiding the researchers in rigorous study design. This requires a collaborative spirit. So the Mahabharata has inspired philosophers, poets, teachers, and seekers for centuries. It has inspired me. It has inspired me. It has inspired me. Today, it may also inspire rigorous scientific inquiry into the human brain, mind, behavior, health, and society. And the greatest contribution of this atlas is not to provide answers, but to organize questions worthy of careful investigation. And with this, I'll stop here. I'll welcome any questions that you may have. You're welcome to reach out to me by email. My email is nishant.mishra@ivpandit.com. You can see some of my work, spiritual and academic, including my efforts towards initiating the dialogue between you all with the scientific community on ivpandit.com. Hari Om, Om Namaha Shivaya. Dhanyavadaha.